Thanks for joining us for this Healthy Homes Act campaign event. I have to start by saying when I woke up this morning, I had this vague sense of anxiety as though something big was going to happen today, which might have a bearing on the future of our world at least. And I remembered that it must be this session. So anyway, moving on. So this vague sense of anxiety, I think, it seems to be a defining feeling at the moment that many of us are feeling. It's partly the American election, it's partly news around climate change, but it's also this feeling the lockdown's coming back, it's bearing down on us again. It's certainly something I think many of us are feeling at the moment. And I'm talking about this experience and my own worries about this. Sitting in comfy 1920s suburbia, I have a garden outside, I've got 10 minutes walk to the nearest park and a stately home. So what about people less fortunate than ourselves? Lockdown isn't all sourdough starters and knitting when you're living in a converted office block and industrial estate, which lacks windows or access to any real form of amenity space. And we know that this is the real lived experience of so many people living in permitted development rights homes. So could we switch slide, please? And I hardly think that the terrible quality of many of these new homes and the evidence base behind them is something I really need to go into detail on now. So next slide, please. So I don't think these need to be repeated here, but is this sense of urgency, I think, which is why we're in this room at the moment, why we're talking about this and why the Healthy Homes Act matters so much. It's an immediate and quite a visceral challenge, this question of well-being and people's homes. It's not something abstract, which is it's hard to get your mind around. I think the other reason that we're here right now is slightly more positive. We've been making serious progress on our Healthy Homes Act campaign. And it's really time to take stock and reflect on our next steps and where we're going from here. So in a sense, this campaign's timing couldn't have been better with COVID, with this increasing parliamentary interest, which Hugh is going to speak about soon. This is really fuel to something which we've been campaigning on for a long time, and is raising interest outside of our own work to do this. Alongside this increasing concern in Parliament, we've got Lord Nigel Crisp leading the campaign there, and it's building real momentum. Next slide, please. And as the word spread, I think, about the bill and awareness has grown, we've got an increasingly interesting and strong coalition of supporters behind the bill. Many of you will be following this presentation right now, but you can see the breadth, the range of different organisations and individuals now involved in this work. Some of these names listed here have been directly involved in the creation of the bill, and I need to thank you. And many also have just lent their support and their weight behind the bill, including through a series of blog posts articulating why, from a more different organisational perspective, this is such an important campaign and contribution to the debate really on the future of housing quality in England. We've also got quite a significant amount of legal input into the drafting of the bill. So it's hopefully, although it's not perfect, in a really robust place now. So this is where we're up to. It's not perfect. It does represent a genuine platform for fundamental change. So I want to begin really by just talking through where we're up to now in terms of the content of the bill and exactly how it works. I think this is a useful platform to begin from to then lead into our other presentations and Hugh's contribution, looking at what's happened over recent months and some key milestones in the debate around housing standards and where we really go from here. So if we go on to the next slide, I think this is it. This is the bill as it stands at the moment. As we published it in September, we published it in an event with the Healthy Homes and Buildings APPG. It was well attended and we got some really good contributions from parliamentarians. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the broad structure of the bill as it stands. So there are really three pillars of this bill and the way it functions, split across two parts. If we go to the next slide, you'll see one of these, the first set of pillars is around new duties, which the bill brings about to fundamentally change the way that the overall purpose of the planning system and our regulation of the built environment. This first one is a duty on the Secretary of State, which essentially places considerations of health and well-being at the centre of all of the Secretary of State's decisions on the regulation of the built environment. So it's really crucial to mention that this is bigger than planning and it's bigger than housing separately. It arcs across both of those two regulatory regimes and any others which feed into the creation of homes or neighbourhoods as we've defined them in the bill. So this is a high level articulation and purpose for planning. In this next slide, you'll see the other duty, which fits at the other end of the bill and links this together. This is really just a duty on local planning authorities to provide for affordable housing, because we know how absolutely significant affordability is for the health and well-being of residents in these new homes. So they together buttress the overall bill and provide the new context in which the centre, the core of the bill operates. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see this, what is really the very heart of the bill. We've been campaigning hard on these for a long time, and I'll go into more detail in a second about what these specific principles now are. But the principles sit at the very top of the bill. We have these changes to the overall purpose of planning through the duty on the Secretary of State and on affordable housing. And then the government is required through this bill to legislate for a series of healthy homes principles. They then have to produce a white paper which articulates how these principles will be delivered through the current policy regime, whether that's through the NPPF, whether it's through planning guidance, whether it's through the housing standards. All of these have to be shifted to take into account these new requirements. And then this trickle-down effect begins. You start at the very top level with these principles in national level policy, and then local plans to be going in conformity with this high level then also have to consider the principles. At the same time, these principles arch across all government departments which have relevant say in this, so they link policy making more effectively together in terms of government silos. Developments which don't accord with the healthy homes principles, which are being primary legislation, can be contested more easily on the ground. And it provides a continuing theme throughout government policy on housing and planning, and on the quality, regulating the quality of the built environment. So these are really the linchpin through the system. And what they do in themselves is define what exactly a home which supports its residents' health and well-being comprises. And it's also important to mention that it just does not focus just on homes, but on the local level, on the neighbourhood level. So it's got that place-based focus. If we go to the next slide, we can see the content of these principles particularly. Now, in the development of these principles, we really tried to focus on things which are not just what the evidence points to as being extremely significant for our health and well-being, but they're really common sense. As a sort of rule of thumb, we focused on things which we thought the general public would be outraged to realise there isn't stronger minimum standards already in existence for each of these principles. Things like access to natural light, which I think Ben might talk about later in relation to PDR, because there's been important changes there, but also access to green space, walkable neighbourhoods, air quality, things like thermal comfort. So many of these different areas of these principles currently have no minimum standards embedded in law associated with them. And if we go on to the final part of the bill, this is that final third pillar, which I mentioned at the beginning. This effectively is a means of implementation and redress, and ensuring that the principles and the new duties we place on the Secretary of State to transform the regulatory system actually happen on the ground. So the Healthy Homes Commissioner has been modelled on the Children's Commissioner, and it's about advising the Secretary of State on the effective implementation of the Healthy Homes principles, develop enforcement mechanisms as well, which will then develop over time and become stronger, publish reports for Parliament and advise Parliament on these issues, and sort of raise the attention of the sector in relation to this. So if we go to the next slide, I think to wrap up, this is where the bill is now. Like I said, it is not perfect. It's an important contribution to the debate, and I'm sure it will mutate and develop more over time, especially as it begins to move through Parliament. And the next steps of our campaign will be something I'll come on to in a minute. So I think that's really enough for me explaining where we're up to now with how the bill works, how we aim to transform the regulatory system relating to the built environment with this. But we're really here to hear more from our four speakers who are going to share insights from their research into the regulation of the built environment and what we need to change to ensure that all new homes support health and well-being. So yeah, we have, to begin with, we'll hear from Ben Clifford, who is an associate professor in the Bartlett School of Planning at UCL. His research focuses on the relationship between planning reform, and the modernisation of the state. And I think he's particularly well known for his research recently into the expansion of PDR, including for the government, to great controversy, which we'll hear about today. We'll then broaden out from PDR to hear from Professor Matthew Carmona. He is Professor of Planning and Urban Design at the Bartlett at UCL, and researches urban design governance, the design and management of public space, and the value of urban design. He also chairs the Place Alliance, which has done some crucial research in the quality of new developments, as well as housing quality and lockdown, which we'll hear about. I think this is extremely present and an important situation. And as I mentioned earlier, these questions around lockdown really bring issues of housing quality to all of us, even when we might not normally consider them. And so that leads neatly into our presentation from Millie Brown, who is from the Centre for Ageing Better. For the last few years, Millie has worked with policy and research at several local authorities. She's now at Ageing Better, where Millie provides research advice, commissions and manages evidence projects, and largely specialising in the key goal of age-friendly housing. She'll be discussing healthy ageing, poor quality homes, and their good homes inquiry. And then our final academic or research presentation will be from Dr. Nancy Holman, who's Director of Planning Studies at the LSE. She works on planning and housing issues primarily in the UK and is currently undertaking research on changes to the UK planning system and the perceptions and acceptability of higher density development. And she'll be taking a higher level look at why we're in the position we're in at the moment. We'll then have a chance for questions to the presenters before Hugh will consider the significance of our speakers' research and look ahead to the future of the Healthy Homes Act campaign in relation to our speakers' presentations. So we'll definitely be finished by 5 o'clock. I'm aiming to wrap things up closer to 4:30 if possible, so that we've all got plenty of time for panic buying in advance of the lockdown. And feel free to ask questions throughout, which I'll then curate at the end via the Q&A functionality in Zoom. That's the way to reach us with questions. So before all this though, there's been some key moments recently in terms of planning reform and the political debate around it. So I want to welcome Hugh to discuss these and what they mean for our campaign to end substandard new housing.
Well, thanks, Dan. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to be very brief because we've got 4 fantastic speakers who you'd rather hear from. But some key themes I just want to emphasise, as well as talking very briefly about the government's white paper and the direction that we might see planning reform going, I think, over the next sort of 18 months. The first thing to emphasise is that I had absolutely no idea we would get as far as we have with the Healthy Homes Act. And it is driven by a collective and shared concern about something we don't like to talk about, which is the moral question about housing standards. And I think that has come from a conversation we've had with all of you, with all sorts of partners, and I think that ethos is really important. This isn't a TCPA initiative. In fact, increasingly in Parliament, it's great that it's Nigel Crisp's bill, and he has become a great advocate for us. And I think that whether he takes it as a private member's bill or whether we seek to amend other legislation, principally the building safety legislation, there is something very important that's happened, which is an awareness of the importance of the built environment to people's health and well-being, and also this great desire to create something better post-COVID, to be able to reconstruct a different kind of way of regulating the built environment, which is not constantly falling back on risk reduction, but has this very positive and creative idea of enabling people's health and well-being. That is not a new idea, as you all know, but it is an important one. But if that is the positive context for it, we're not underestimating how difficult it will be to bring this bill into legislation, but there are both, as I say, routes to amend and then routes for the entire legislation. We will do everything we can to make that happen. I think there's obviously stuff pushing in the opposite direction, and so 2 or 3 things from government that have made the need for this bill, I think, even more important, and it's certainly it's added the kind of political octane factor in terms of the debate. The planning white paper is one thing, changes and extension of permitted development is another, and also other changes announced on to the existing planning regime have all become mixed up together, I think, in politicians' minds into a really very powerful assault on what's left of the English planning system. And there's no word you can use to exaggerate that, because the Prime Minister's forward to the planning white paper for England says we want to tear down the system, quote. And while there's rhetoric in the white paper on planning, which no one can disagree with, well, rhetoric is completely cheap, isn't it? It's what you actually get in the core recommendations. And there I think that we can have no confidence that they're going to improve issues or address standards, which they don't in any kind of clear way. So there's a lot of worrying issues there, but perhaps the most significant for the debate today is the government's announcement of the extension of permitted development, partly to demolition and rebuild within certain circumstances, partly to 2-storey extensions, partly to relaxation of change of use town centre functions. All of that was pushed through extremely quickly. It's now all subject to a legal challenge. But the interesting issue about that is that even there, when the outcomes of permitted development, as many others have demonstrated, are so shameful in so many cases, even there has been a controversy about whether government looked at the evidence, well, Ben's evidence, let's be clear about that, and considered it properly, and certainly issues about democratic accountability. But for those of you in local government, there's two propositions I think that are important here. One, how much control do you now have over your own town centres? How many planning change of use issues do you actually have any input at all over? And the answer to that is very few. So there is a real hollowing out of control at a critical time when local government needs control over the future of town centres to make great places as a result of this agenda. It is true, though, that there have been victories of a sort, haven't there? Because the government has recognised that there's a need for light. I'm not quite sure what to say about that, really, when a government has to be reminded that people have a need for natural light in their homes. I guess that's a victory, but it feels a very peculiar one. And there's also an idea that space standards might be introduced for permitted development, although they won't be introduced for the rest of planning, which is peculiar. And then there's a list of things now in prior approval you can think about, which local government perhaps can make something of in terms of protecting their communities from the worst excesses of this development. But at the heart of this, I'll leave you with this dilemma because it's an important one. In Parliament, the Secretary of State said that the only thing wrong with permitted development is that one or two private sector developers had exploited it for ill. That is plainly false. The idea of deregulation leading to positive outcomes is simply a mirage, as the evidence suggests, and does produce immensely damaging outcomes. I actually think that the collective response now in Parliament and out in the country is not to want a free-for-all, but is actually want this sense of building back on places that will give people some sense of health and well-being going forward. So even though the politics of this, I think, are quite difficult, and wait to see how government responds, what we haven't had is any demolition of the idea of overarching legislation on building standards. There's a growing consensus that that's the right approach to take. And the more deregulation takes place, the more that case is made, given what happens on the ground. Finally, it is bitterly sad that this country has to relearn what happens when you deregulate building standards and planning. And the standards that come through the permitted development process are plainly shameful. Shameful to all of us as professionals that this country could have done this and plainly been so stupid. But at the same time, if that makes us reinvent a new platform for creating places, well, maybe that's a price that has to be paid, sad though it is for the people who live in these places. And of course, they will have to be some kind of slum program, won't there? Some kind of restoration process, some slum clearance program, because of decisions we made in the early 21st century about how to house people. I never would have believed that we would have reached that point in this country. However, all of that fuels a real, I think, groundswell of support for the Healthy Homes Act, which we really hope will have some impact going forward. I'm going to stop there, Dan, if that's okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks you. It was really powerfully put. So yeah, without further ado, then I'm going to pass over to Ben Clifford for his presentation. Take it away, Ben.
Great, thanks, Dan, and thanks for the invite to contribute to this session. So I'm going to update everyone on permitted development research that we did that was published in the summer and some of the changes that we've seen since then. Next slide, please. Just to say that the research I did was with my colleagues, Patricia Canales, Jess Firm and Nicola Livingston at UCL and Alex Lord and Rich Dunning from the University of Liverpool. We were commissioned by the ministry last August to undertake research to look into the quality of commercial to residential conversions under permitted development across England, something which James Brokenshire committed to in March when he was, March 2019, when he was Secretary of State. So we undertook this research into the quality standard of homes delivered through changes of use permitted development rights, which we submitted at the end of January this year. That there was a bit of a delay, but it was published in July, the same day as the Russia report, just before Parliament went into recess for the summer. And it's available now from that link from the ministry website. So in the time I've got, I can only give a flavour of what it says. There's a lot more in the report. what we did is we looked at conversions in 11 different case study local authorities across England. And these are selected to give us a mix of urban and rural, a mix of all regions, a mix of levels of economic prosperity. And we looked at the commercial to residential conversions that we've seen in those authorities from 2015 to 2018 via permitted development and comparison ones through planning permission. So if it's a listed building or it's a conservation area or perhaps a developer wants to do something more extensive than they can through permitted development, you do still get planning applications in the traditional way for these changes of use and give us a nice ability to be able to compare similar schemes between permitted development and planning permission. Next slide, please. So we looked at all the schemes that were put forward for permitted development, prior approval or planning permission in the relevant local authorities over this 3-year period. Often you get multiple consents for the same building, but once we'd sort of stripped that down, we had 639 buildings. We visited each one in person to see if schemes were implemented and get a sense of the sort of location and the exterior quality. And then we selected from that 240 implemented schemes. That gave us a total of over 3,000 new residential units that have been created to check some more detailed aspects, things like the space standards from floor plans, natural light from floor plans, etc. We also interviewed planners in all those local authorities, 11 case studies, and similarly developers and agents, 12 interviews with them as well. It's worth saying that we were looking at more factors than perhaps have been looked at previously in permitted development. I've led research myself in 2018 for the RICS, which started to look at this, but this looked at a much greater range of factors. And in some areas that we looked at, there wasn't too much difference between permitted development and prior approval. Actually, if you're doing a conversion, rates of changing the windows or putting new doors in, or putting new cladding on were similar between permitted development and planning permission conversions. Energy performance was similar across both types, although interestingly, EPC certificates aren't available for a large number of these conversions, and the ministry just couldn't really explain why when they should have that data. And in terms of how, on average, accessible they were to shops or public transport, they were quite similar between the two routes. That actually doesn't mean planning permission schemes are always getting it as right as, and we'll hear more, I'm sure, on that from Matthew, but it was similar between these two routes. Next slide, please. Where it was notably different was firstly in terms of the immediate location. Although a minority of these schemes are on sort of industrial estates and business parks, it was exceptionally rare under planning permission, but it was more likely, 8 times more likely under permitted development. So the majority of permitted development conversions are in town centre locations, but there is this subset that are in the middle of industrial estates. There's a small picture there of one in Bristol, and they offer extremely poor residential amenity, very concerning if you're in the middle of a still functioning industrial estate, often very cut off from shops and services. So in those cases, the extremes are what we should be concerned about. And then when we started looking at particularly the sort of interior design of permitted development conversions, there was again cause for concern. So only 22% of dwellings created through permitted development would meet nationally described space standards, compared to 73% of planning permission units. And when we looked at that, the permitted development units were often well below. So if we go with a minimum of 37 meters squared for one bed, one person flat, these permitted development conversions were often 16, 17, 18 meters squared. Whereas the planning permission ones that missed it were often sort of 34 meters squared. And when the planning permission ones had missed it, in some cases they actually complied with older SPG. In Crawley, they had an SPG dating back quite a few years that they used that recommended sort of 34 meters squared minimum. Or the planning officers had looked and said, well, it's a listed building, it's difficult to convert, we'll accept a slightly below with other compensating factors. That wasn't the case with permitted development. Many more studios created through permitted development and one beds than planning permission, often with little sense of match to actual local housing need. And again, this just gives us a sense that some people have said it's a sort of minority of permitted development schemes that are poor quality. It's not. There's many examples everywhere where there's problems. Next slide, please. We looked at windows. The single aspect is often something that we now look for in planning to move away from for higher quality residential, but a vast majority of permitted development conversions are only single aspect windows. 10 units had no windows at all. Absolutely appalling residential quality there. But beyond that, actually many more had really poor natural light. They have strange sort of dogleg layouts and long narrow flats, and some windows with really small into undercroft areas, and then other rooms with no windows at all. So it was a fairly widespread problem, particularly when you had big floor plate conversions. Amenity space, something we're all thinking about a lot under lockdown. Only 3.5% of the permitted development units had any access to private amenity space. Planning permission not perfect either, but definitely not as bad as the permitted development schemes. And then only 10 of the permitted development schemes out of 138 had made any contribution to SIL whatsoever. Most can avoid this because there's a loophole. If it was at least partially occupied before conversion, it doesn't need to pay any SIL. It's not creating extra floor space, even though residential use is placing extra burdens on local infrastructure, particularly social and green infrastructure. Because we were looking at different categories, we could start breaking down. All categories of permitted development were worse than planning permission in terms of residential quality, but there was a differentiation. Office to residential was worse than retail to residential or light industrial to residential. Retail to residential schemes, because of the way that prior approval works, are usually smaller schemes, so 2 or 3 unit schemes, perhaps in the middle of a high street. Storage to residential, I hadn't quite comprehended before doing this research. Those conversions are actually often on farms. They're often in rural areas where essentially a barn is a storage unit, has been converted to residential. The actual conversions tended to be higher quality, again, with that compared to office to residential. And the larger size of office to residential schemes often compounded the issues. So you often had really poor amenity space, really poor space standards, and poor natural light, and many of these units in the same building. It all sort of compounds together. Next slide, please. We also looked at the sort of geographical relationship with quality. Everywhere we looked in all the 11 case study authorities, housing quality was generally worse under permitted development than full planning permission. However, the sort of compliance did vary when it's entirely the women developers. It is interesting to see the trends. Essentially, if it's a more deprived authority, that those on the left in terms of multiple deprivation scores of this graph, then the percentage of units complying with space standards is tending to be lower. Slight exception in Crawley as a new town, and I think again that's down to this large stock of sort of 60s and 70s redundant office space. So we concluded from this research that PD conversions seem to create worse quality residential environments than planning permission conversions in relation to a number of factors widely linked to health, well-being, and the quality of life of future occupiers. Next slide, please. So we submitted that to government. There was no response from government to our independent research. In June, there was this announcement that they were amending the permitted development to require adequate natural light to all habitable rooms, which is better than not requiring it, although I think it's a bit depressing that the low is reached in terms of should we have a window or not in a flat. But again, they didn't publish the report. There was no response. Then suddenly in July, they published the report without a response and introducing additional permitted development rights. You can add 2 stories to existing residential or commercial full residential buildings, and this right to demolish and rebuild commercial as residential. There's slightly more requirements in these compared to the previous permitted developments. So, for example, the local authority can consider external appearance or the design of the new building for the demolish and rebuild. And it would be interesting to see how local authorities use these powers going through in the prior approval process. In August, the white paper, if you look at it, it does mention permitted development. It proposes using it further if the schemes match sort of pattern books. Not quite clear entirely how much they would cover that actually relates to the quality of life of residents as opposed to just whether they match the vernacular. But it also announced that in future the infrastructure levy should cover all PD conversions to residential. And then suddenly with this opposition motion about the extensions to permitted development at the end of September in Parliament, a couple of hours before that, the Secretary of State suddenly announced in future permitted development conversions will need to comply with the nationally described space standards, although as yet that's unspecified when that's going to take effect. This one is an example from Horsham. People now send me permitted development examples. This is adding 2 floors on top of an existing commercial building. It's one of the first examples I've seen of that. The flats are proposed, they meet the space standards. They're generally about 40 meters squared here for 1 beds. But a condition of that new permitted development is you can't have windows on the side elevations. And this is a building that's side onto the street. So what we have here is some windows on the front and rear elevations, but for the majority of flats down the side, there's no windows because that's the side elevation. It's not allowed under this permitted development. But we do now need adequate natural light. So what have we got here? We've got skylights for the 4th floor. And then for the 3rd floor, there's these light wells going down through the 4th floor to give natural light into those dwellings. And this, for me, I think is just an example of why we still need to worry. These flats would meet space standards, they'd have natural light, but the majority of them wouldn't have a window. You wouldn't have a view of the outside world at all. Does that create the high quality residential experience we should be aspiring to? I'd suggest absolutely not. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I've heard it claimed that there's just a few examples of poor quality permitted development conversions. I know some of the media coverage does concentrate on 1 or 2 pretty heinous examples, but actually there's poor quality examples everywhere in all our 11 case study authorities. And I pretty much feel that you could ask me to look in any local authority in England and I would find you examples of poor quality permitted development conversions that are harmful to the health and well-being of their residents. Most pressing in that has been space standards and access to natural light. Then access to outdoor space, immediate location and infrastructure contributions. With recent developments, we are seeing some progress on natural light and space standards. But some of the other factors just seem more challenging because a permitted development by its nature is saying the principle of development is fine, we just need to check a few narrow technical things. But actually in some cases it's not fine. In some cases the immediate location is absolutely inappropriate. More broadly, finally, I think this just shows the danger of as of right planning of the type being proposed in the white paper unless you have adequate safeguards. If you're just checking a few technical things and you're not checking enough, then as we saw with that last example, you can still actually create really poor quality residential. And that's why I still think we urgently need the Healthy Homes Act as a minimum safeguard. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was brilliant and such a powerful illustration of how the current approach is broken and the kind of the logical foundations of that approach just don't make sense. And the need for this a system based on strong minimum standards with some element of discretion there as well. So without further ado then, next up we've got Matthew Carmona. I'll hand over to you right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to talk about a piece of research which we launched a few weeks ago, which in a way just sort of layers further evidence, I suppose, on the back of the sort of things that Ben was talking about, to underpin this idea of a Healthy Homes Act. And the report is called Home Comforts. And you might remember 8 months or so ago, we all lived in a world where we did things in different places. We had work, we had school, we had home, we had leisure, and then we had lockdown, and all these things came together in our homes, in our local neighborhoods, within our local communities. And then we had a period where there was a sort of gradual release, and some things started to get back to normal. And then come September, schools went back, but then there was a gradual tightening. And now we're in a period of lockdown, or about to enter a period of lockdown again. And through this whole time, we've relied much more on technology to do the things that we used to do spatially around our towns and cities. And we've also seen evidence increasingly building that this has had a deteriorating impact on our health and on our happiness and well-being. So this piece of research really aimed to use the period of lockdown as a way of stress testing our homes and our neighborhoods to identify how they perform, and how they carry on performing in terms of the everyday support they give us in our lives, and how resilient they are in the face of a crisis that we're currently facing, but also just how resilient they are in terms of meeting our day-to-day needs. Ultimately, we may never entirely return to the world as it was before COVID. So we did a survey. It was a national survey across the UK. I won't say too much about this, but there was 25 questions, open and closed questions. The important thing is we had 2,500 responses from around the UK. The survey began by asking people about a series of questions about themselves and their own circumstances at home. And that was both so that we could correlate the data on their experience against these sorts of factors, but also we wanted to test whether there was any bias in the survey. You know, were we surveying all people like us on this call today, or would it fairly reflect the national profile? And what we found is that in all of these ways, the survey, the 2,500, did fairly reflect the national picture, although certainly with a bias towards London. Half the responses, in fact, were from London, and there's certainly a more of a white-collar experience, I think, reported in the findings. What did we find? Well, first of all, on our homes, we found that for many, the positive thing was that for many, they were very comfortable in their homes during lockdown. 2/3 were comfortable, but that still left a sixth that were reporting they were uncomfortable during this period. Almost 11 million people, I should say, across the UK reporting that they were uncomfortable. Houses seem to be more comfortable than flats. And mid and high-rise blocks were the least comfortable in the survey. Perhaps particularly concerning, the newest dwellings were the most uncomfortable. I don't know whether that reflects the sort of things that Ben was talking about, probably a wider issue to do with our development and design processes generally. Key workers, interestingly, and perhaps perversely, were the most uncomfortable, as seen as they were still the ones that were going out away from their home. I think that probably reflects something of the profile in that group, the sort of social profile. And social renters suffered the worst. They were the most uncomfortable in their homes. Why were some less comfortable than others? Well, the strongest design-based comfort predictor was access to private open space. And that meant anything from a garden to a balcony. And those who had a garden were more comfortable than those who had a terrace, who were more comfortable than those who had a shared balcony, who were more comfortable than those who had a balcony, who were more comfortable than those who had a shared garden, who were more comfortable than those who had none of the above. More space means more comfort. So if we have more space in the home, we tend to be more comfortable. That would, most of us would expect such a finding, I suppose. And most of us were able to work comfortably at home when we had to, although 7% struggled, and those were concentrated to some degree within the sort of social renting sector. Internal design was important. The sorts of factors that others have talked about, fresh air, daylight, noise and insulation, that we need these good environmental conditions in the home if we're to be comfortable, but also people were looking for increased cellularity so that they could work from home in this period. And we want more. We want bigger, we want better. Even if we're comfortable, we want more private open space, we want more space in our homes. So the key factors, the keys to success were garden. People wanted a back garden to escape to outdoors. These people here comment that they become gardeners in training, an experience that would be echoed by many of us. Or good space standards in the home, good Edwardian space standard, this person says, plenty of space to spread out and quiet corners to read. What about our neighbourhoods? Well, again, most of us were comfortable. More of us were comfortable in our neighbourhoods than our homes, actually. But a minority suffer from poorly designed neighbourhoods. So whilst 3/4 of us said we were comfortable, 4%, that's almost 3 million, said that they found their neighbourhoods quite difficult. They didn't support day-to-day needs during lockdown. That wasn't reflective of the type of the neighbourhood, so whether people were in rural, suburban or urban areas didn't really seem to matter. But high-rise comes out poorly. So neighbourhoods comprising houses score markedly better than those with apartment blocks, particularly if high-rise. And again, newer neighbourhoods came out worse. In fact, we saw a progressive deterioration in how people rated their neighbourhood from 1919 every decade up to the present time. The quality of the neighbourhood in terms of the experience really deteriorated. And owner-occupiers were the happiest within their neighbourhoods, followed by private renters, with social renters reporting the least happy experience. And if we lived in a poor quality home, that wasn't compensated for by a good quality neighbourhood. These things were very much judged by respondents in isolation of each other. Key factors are access to parks and greenery are fundamental, proximity to parks. People over 10 minutes from a park reported dissatisfaction. 5 minutes was much better. Over 10 minutes, people were dissatisfied. The same for shops and amenities. A 5 to 10 minute city. There's been a lot talked about 15 or 20 minute cities. Our research suggested that needs to be a 5 or 10 minute city should be the aspiration. People wanted better space for walking and cycling and quieter streets that they could exercise in and were well connected to other places. And everybody saw COVID as an opportunity. That idea has already been expressed. A strong desire to see the crisis as a point in which we can aspire for better in the future. So key to success, some of the keys to success, larger green spaces close to us that people can access on a more frequent basis, and places that we can walk to or cycle to. I don't drive, so it's hard to get to essential shops without relying on a different household member. Hardly ideal. And then on our communities, this was the final sort of issue that we looked at. First of all, we asked people about their experience of their community pre-COVID. And most people felt that their pre-COVID, there was some feeling of community, although it was fairly rudimentary. Rural tended to have stronger feeling of community. People had less a feeling of community if they were higher up, so in high blocks. And also they had a stronger feeling of community pre-COVID if they were in older areas of housing. And also churn seems to reduce a sense of community. So people in the private renting sector, where there's a high degree of churn, in particular, seem to report a lower degree of community pre-COVID. How did the lockdown affect that? Well, community or a sense of community, or a boost to a sense of community, certainly seems to have helped us through, whoever we are, wherever we are. Most people felt there had been a strengthening of our sense of community that affected all types of dwelling, no matter where we were. But if you already had a sense of community, or a stronger sense of community, then your community was boosted more during lockdown. If you had a weaker sense, then it was boosted less. Higher, newer, and social again came off worse. If you were higher off the ground in social housing or in newer housing, you felt less of a sense of community boost during lockdown. But silver lining, respondents reported that people seemed friendlier and the environment seemed to recover, and people had more time for each other during this period. Whether we'll experience that again in the coming lockdown, we shall see. So people felt positives, things like being able to enjoy time at home with our loved ones, and also speaking to neighbours and talking to people in the streets. Even children playing out in quieter streets were sort of positives that were reported. But also negatives. Some people were concerned that more people were at home in their neighbourhoods, in their local parks, and they liked the fact that previously there was less people at home in their suburban neighbourhoods. Or particularly in London, there was a concern expressed that, well, this quote sums it up well. London housing situation is not for living outdoors. It's indoors. It's for living outdoors with the option for having a bed under the roof. In other words, people accept lower living standards in the home because they have access to all those amenities outdoors. But during lockdown, they didn't have those, of course. So just to conclude, we had a series of recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of these, just to highlight a few of them. Starting with all new homes and newly converted homes should have mandated access to private open space, even if that's just to a balcony. So that's more than just about the space inside, but also access to private open space outside as well. Reflecting Ben's points here, without exception, all new and newly converted homes should be built to decent national minimum space standards, such as the nationally described space standards, and it seems that is happening. But we also need this access to fresh air, daylight, good insulation, transmission of noise. Those things are critical and would really benefit being described properly in legislation. On the neighbourhood, those in higher and denser, or rather the higher and denser we build, the greater we need to have regard to access to quality parks and green spaces and local facilities. We're not always building those ways, unfortunately. And also we should aspire to this 5 or 10-minute city with good access, walkability and cyclability to these sorts of facilities. And the final thing I just wanted to highlight was that social housing should enjoy the same essential amenities as housing for sale or to privately rent, including access to the qualities recommended, the sort of things that I've been talking about, across the different dwelling and neighbourhood scales. So if people are interested in the report, then it's called Home Comforts, and if you go to the Place Alliance website, you can download it there, including all of the recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating how lockdown both showed us the failings of the current regulatory system and our approach to delivering housing, as well as the kind of way forwards and the kind of things which people actually liked about the lockdown and those conditions, and what we need to build into developments in the future, whether we're thinking about our resilience to things like pandemics or not. So with one eye on the time, I'm going to pass straight over to Millie. Thanks, Millie.
Hiya, thank you for that. Okay, so today I'm here to speak to you about healthy ageing and poor quality homes and our work at the Centre for Ageing Better. So we have the next slide, please. For those that don't know, we're a charitable foundation and our vision is for everybody to enjoy a good later life. In particular, as part of this, one of our key goals is for homes that are suitable for healthy ageing, and we have a target that we will have 1 million less non-decent homes by 2030. Today, I'm going to be running you through the work that we're doing to try and achieve that. Next slide, please. And just for those that don't know, we asked to put this in sub-priorities, a wider structure, but I will move past that quite quickly so I have enough time to get everything else. Okay. So today I'm here to talk to you about our research into older people's housing needs, in particular our work into people's experience of living in poor quality housing. The experiences of people who live in poor quality housing is key to the evidence as part of a push for the Healthy Homes Act. As a society, we can no longer rely purely on poor performing retrofit policies to improve housing quality. Houses should be built to enable us to live healthy and independent lives, and at Aging Better, we believe our research into poor quality homes is a key driver in this campaign. As we know, poor quality housing can cause or worsen health conditions, reduce a person's quality of life, exacerbate housing, and can cause and can even result in premature death. However, when Aging Better looked into the data behind this and the available accessible evidence, we found it was slightly lacking. Therefore, in 2019, alongside Care and Repair England, we released the Home Dry Report. The main thing to come for that is we found that 10 million people in England are at risk because they live in poor quality homes, and this is a result of poor quality built homes. We see the Home and Dry Report as the basis, or stepping stones, should we say, to our newest and biggest venture into improving poor quality homes, the Good Home Inquiry, which I'm here to talk to you about today. It's important to add, the whilst our organisation does, of course, focus on those between the ages of 50 to 70, our work is applicable for the need for healthy homes for all ages. Okay, next slide, please. So, as I said, we've recently launched the Good Home Inquiry. It's an evidence-based analysis of England's housing policies to determine the causes of and solutions to the poor quality of much of our housing issues. The intention is to move beyond the current definition of a non-decent home and to create a good home. The inquiry will run until mid-2021, and today I'm going to talk to you the research that we're conducting as part of that to build this evidence base to support the inquiry. Next slide, please. And whilst I won't be spending much time going over this, we just had a great presentation on COVID-19 and homes. I thought it was important to highlight our own work into homes, health and COVID-19, which we actually used to launch the Good Home Inquiry. The importance of this review was its ability to highlight how the people most vulnerable to COVID-19 are also the most likely to live in poor quality housing. So for us, older people, also those with existing health conditions, people on lower incomes, and those from ethnic minority groups. We used this report to launch a Good Home Inquiry, which I will now actually talk about the lived experience element, which is key to the whole webinar today. So next slide, please. Okay, so one of the most fundamental outputs from the Good Home Inquiry is a well-developed and applicable series of policies that we believe will aid in decreasing the number of poor quality homes. However, it's essential that to support those policies, we are able to describe the problem, challenges and consequences of poor quality housing of those who live in this reality. A lot of research looks beyond that and doesn't take into account the individual, and we need these powerful stories to show the need to improve quality of housing. The aim of the research was to build a rich picture of participants' experience of their homes when approaching later life. So this includes the relationship they have with their homes, the issues they face, and the barriers they face to accessing support or making a change in their home. So to capture these stories, a qualitative multi-stage methodology was developed, comprising of an app-based diary task, which was supplemented with in-depth interviews. The sample comprised of only 20 participants. However, we felt this reflected a diverse breadth of experience, circumstances, also included those who live in different tenures, different demographics, race, ethnicity, gender, and also importantly, different geographical locations. As we know, we can't assume that policies fit across nationally, locally we need to look at as well. So the research questions were, what are the experiences of people approaching later life who live in poor quality homes? What impact does living in a poor quality home have on the participants' lives? For example, this means their wealth, well-being, financial security, and social connections. And also, have they tried to access support to make changes? What are the barriers they faced? So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk you through our initial findings. Okay. So as we can see from here, we add the app diagrams, we actually had photos as well as things, but I'm going to take you through the key themes as the research hasn't actually finished yet, but it's good to give you a good idea of what we're kind of seeing at the moment. So our initial findings suggest that despite a strong sense of attachment with their home, participants identified a range of issues within their homes, and these fell under three key themes: moving around the home, issues of being warm and dry, feeling safe, secure, and connected at home. Unsurprisingly, moving around the home, the issues the participants most face were trips and fall hazards, inaccessible and suitable bathrooms, like we can see the one in the photo and the slides, difficulties entering and moving around the home, and limited storage space. Again, with warm and dry theme, mold and damp was a serious issue, and within COVID-19, it's even more applicable, as we know at the moment, spending more time, especially with the second lockdown. It's really that we focus on this. Poor installation in cold homes and ineffective heating appliances, with also expensive heating bill payments leading to fuel poverty. Finally, the final theme was feeling safe, secure, and connected at home. Again, connected at home is ever more important when people are spending more time at home, especially older generations who may not have access to the same resources as we do, such as good quality internet. So, sense of safety in their home in terms of the physical security of the property was a big issue for people. Sense of safety in their local area and connections to neighbours, again, very important at the moment. And finally, issues related to internet connectivity, phone services. The implications they had meant that people felt more isolated and lonely. And again, the physical dimension of the home is key to improving this. So that's kind of the overall of our initial findings, but I'm actually going to take you through to the next slide, where we talk about individuals and barriers to change. So our research also looked into the challenges participants face when trying to make changes to their homes. Whilst, with the support for the government to change policy, actually behavioural change was a big factor in this as well. So under three themes: environmental, attitudinal, and awareness. For environmental, finance was unsurprisingly the biggest challenge individuals faced when trying to make changes to their homes. It's especially evident among owner-occupiers who had more agency to make changes that would cost money compared to those who in rented accommodation. People's ability to make changes in their homes is also underpinned by their tenure type. For example, private renters did not always feel that their landlords would agree to make changes to suit their needs as they get older, and those in housing association owned properties who had negative perceptions and experiences of the housing association could lead to feelings of a loss of agency for some other participants. Well, particularly relevant to the Healthy Homes Act campaign, the nature of the homes and the physical adaptability of the homes and rooms also presented limitations. For example, older buildings were more restrictive with change that could be made, and examples of properties being too small or poorly designed led to major structure changes such as wet rooms. So, attitudinal, again, as I said, participants' confidence to make changes played a part, which manifested in many different ways. For example, participants who were able to make changes to their home when they were younger, having diminishing confidence to do this when growing older, health issues, this led to challenges accepting this new identity. From someone who was capable and self-sufficient to having to rely on someone else and navigate the processes to get support. Trust was also a key theme, where there were significant anxieties had around trusting tradespeople to make good quality changes, repairs, and often making changes themselves resulted in injury. And overall, to honest, participants' attitudes toward later life, as a result of not feeling old, the need to think about making changes to their homes in the future did not feel urgent for some. If they saw their house was currently suitable, this resulted in feeling that they did not take action immediately. Examples of this is end of history illusion, where as people age, they do not necessarily see themselves as evolving or changing as you draw on your past to think about your future. This is more pronounced when there is a subtle progression of aging compared to those who had significant health or mobility challenges. Building lifetime healthy homes would therefore mean that no individual will suffer as a result of leaving it too late. Finally, awareness. Participants not knowing where to go and having limited awareness of support options available them, linked to mistrust of tradesmen and a lack of awareness of impartial and trustworthy information. Examples of Sun City how to navigate relationships where there are different actors, such as landlords, councils, there's a lot of you there yourself, and housing associations. As you can see, part of this project, whilst behaviour change may not be limited to new homes, we see this as vital to showing the importance of having a Healthy Homes Act rather than relying on the individual to make sure they have healthy homes throughout their lives. So finally, just go to the next slide. This research will be used to support a policy push for improving poor quality homes alongside our developed policy recommendations. So therefore, the final project as part of the inquiry has been to commission a large-scale policy review from the period of 1974 to the present day. This is currently in progress, but the evidence review will focus on identifying programmes, initiatives, interventions and practices implemented with the intention of improving quality of housing. It will understand the theory and practice of delivery, it will evaluate effectiveness and efficiency, and it will identify critical success factors. It will also focus on a number of overlapping domains, which can have both physical and psychological actors. And following this, we will create a short list of policy options, which will now be carrying out economic analysis. This economic analysis will focus on what would each cost, who would have to pay, and what would the impact be. But as I said, this isn't actually being completed yet. We're in the process of it, but I do encourage you all to follow this if you are interested in this work. Finally, next slide, please. And to kind of summarize the importance of our work in this area and existing homes, whilst it might be to retrofit, it's a point that we can't rely on retrofit. All of these issues I described to you today show that we need to have the Healthy Homes Act to make a change, and therefore the Centre for Ageing Better strongly supports Town and Country Planning Association as Healthy Homes Act as a way of creating a clear definition of what a healthy home should be, and to bring in the law that would require all homes to meet the standard. We support the approach that the Act will be put into law, a series of basic principles which together define what constitutes a healthy home and neighbourhoods. And this Act aligns with Ageing Better's ambition that all new homes should meet accessibility standards. And we also agree the set of principles that have been set out as necessary for ensuring good and mental and physical health. Okay, that's me for today. I hope kind of give you insight into the work we're doing at Ageing Better and the importance of it. But if you please have any questions or would like to add anything, and my particular areas of interest at the moment for the inquiry are the environment, digital, finance and repair. So anyone insights into that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Millie. I'm going to pass straight on now to Nancy. Take it away, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Dan. I will be quick because I can talk fast and I have no slides. So I wanted to start off by just saying there's something that Hugh said at the beginning of this that I think is really interesting. And he talked a little bit about kind of a moral standard in planning. And I think that we ignore this at our peril. And I think this is increasingly what we're being asked to do by continuing marketization of planning. And the government seems really about to disrupt planning greatly. I mean, I think as long as I've been around, I can remember us having conversations from the government about planners locking things up in cupboards and being slow and not and trying to block development, and the planning system needing to be changed. But the fundamentals of the planning system, the site-by-site flexibility that we've had, is something that we've more or less been able to keep. With the new suggestions that are coming out, it really looks very questionable about what is going to remain. Hugh also said about the government talking about disrupting the planning system. And I think that they tend to, it would seem, disrupt for the sake of disruption without necessarily having a clear plan about what they want to do next. although I am sure the current white paper is absolutely oven ready, and all we need to do is negotiate fisheries policy and then we'll be good for a deal. So I think if we look at kind of this bill, this Planning Act, white paper, and we think as well about past policies that the government has been doing over this time period, we can really see what might happen for a healthy home and why a Healthy Homes Act would be incredibly important. So as it stands, the white paper is incredibly market liberalizing, i.e. it really is wanting to push in market principles quite significantly, but it's also incredibly centralizing, which is kind of ironic. They're trying to free things up, and all the while they're trying to gain a lot of control. So by leaving the site-by-site system, it means that communities are only ever going to be able to get involved in planning before development is proposed. So at that kind of first stages. And it's often hard for communities to do that. You tend to not understand what's happening until you see the actual plans. It also leaves things like neighborhood plans in a very weird place, because once these areas have been zoned in your community with a renewal or conservation or what have you, then it leaves that neighborhood plan in kind of a limbo of really, well, what does it mean and what kind of value can it add? And again, these are often based on local communities wanting to do a bit of placemaking and trying to create healthier and better communities. And this really makes that far more difficult. But also, if we look at the things that Ben was telling us about, at things like permitted development and the past trajectory and history of that, then we can see what may be happening ahead. So whilst there have been some limits placed on PDR and what might actually, some quality standards that might go along with it, we also have lots of new PDR coming onto the scene. So we have things like the 2-story up that you also mentioned. If you can imagine that happening in a local neighborhood, in an area, you can see where you're going to get, by necessity out of some of these things, loss of natural light for the person next door, being overlooked, all of those kinds of things that we don't necessarily want to create in our communities. And what's important is we lose all control over being able to do anything about that. There is some talk as well about the idea that, well, there'll be design codes that can help control some of the PDR. But these are being talked about as being maybe 4 to 5 pages of information, which really belies the fact that you need a lot more kind of understanding in detail about creating good and beautiful places than 4 to 5 pages could possibly ever offer you. So these kinds of things are very worrying. The other thing that's incredibly worrying is also in terms of the new use class order, where you've got Class E coming in, which has actually taken in retail, financial services, and also restaurants and put them all into one group, which now, again, I think as Hugh was saying, I don't mean to keep quoting you, Hugh, but it's taking away in terms of placemaking in the high street, a lot of control about what communities can do and how we can create balance on the high street, or balance in our local authorities. After all, planning really was brought in about being flexible and about being able to kind of balance different priorities, social, environmental, and the market, and economic. And these systems really are moving much more towards just trying to make market-based decisions. The only thing that the new white paper seems to do to give us any kind of nice thing to dress up around our concepts of what a healthy home or what a healthy place might be is this idea of local design guides. And while that might be something that could potentially could be something useful, they're talking about these things being locally discussed potentially and then written up, and how one would negotiate that at the local level with the central level as well, quickly enough to actually write a design guide out within the 30 months that they're giving people for creating their local plans, is also highly questionable. So I guess the thing that really concerns me most is that we need to kind of consider that the market, in order to, the way that the market works is that whatever you decide to buy or whatever you decide to consume shows that there is a market for it, and therefore that's an acceptable thing. So the fact that we've got young people in very small flats or disadvantaged people living in really poor standard PDR shows there's a market need for it, but because people are going there, people are consuming it. And I doubt very seriously, if you asked anyone in the UK, is that what you think people, is that what people deserve? Is that what we really want as a society? Most people would say no. And that's why I think something like the Healthy Homes Act, which is having to really describe things that are so basic. We would like to have healthy homes and houses that don't burn down with people in them. It might be nice to have a window in our home, so we'd like to prescribe that there should be, you know, natural light. These are really simple things that we're having to outline. And I think what we need to do as planners as well is not just talk amongst ourselves. It's great to talk here. I'm sure we all have similar ideas, but we need to get the word out to the broader community that in reality, things do get built with no windows. Things can be built that are not of a proper space standard, and that we are walking down the road to reproducing all of the poor conditions that we had when the planning system came in the first place. I fundamentally don't think people understand what things like the planning white paper, changes to PDR, and all of that actually open us up for. And I think that we as planners, or we as advocates for planning, really have a responsibility to try to promote planning as something that has a moral basis, that has really a core to it more widely than where we are. And I recognize we're close to time, so I'm going to leave it there and let people ask questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks to you, Nancy. That was really powerful and a really good end to our 4 contributor presentations. So we've had some excellent questions through. I'm going to begin with questions from the audience, and then I'll return for the final word from Hugh in about hopefully less than 10 minutes time. So I'll try and roughly do this in the order which they came in. Early on, we had a question from Julie Plitchen about the latest update on the legal challenge of PDR and UCO. Obviously, we can only answer this question, I think, from an external TCPA perspective. But Hugh, I was wondering if you could just speak to this, what you're aware of in terms of the latest and the legal challenge to PDR.
Hi. Well, very quickly, the judgment, the case has been heard and the judgment is awaited. It was meant to be an expedited judgment. 2 judges were looking at it. It's plainly caused large amounts of controversy in the legal profession, but my quick assessment of it would be that even if we win the argument, if the argument is won in that case, there's virtually no remedy because, of course, the law was brought in and is being operationalised since September. So I don't think the court has any remedy it can apply, which raises an interesting question about upholding rule of law. I won't say any more about governments and the rule of law at this point, except to say it would be nice if they upheld it.
Thanks, Hugh. Next, we have a really interesting question from Ben Yates, which relates to actually the role of the profession in ensuring engagement over these issues. So he asks, how do we get higher levels of engagement on these key issues that affect the way we live to a broader and younger audience to help prepare the next generation of people for the planning practice? I think it's really interesting how that connects with making the case that Nancy just mentioned in her presentation. But I'm going to target this one, I think, to Ben and Matthew, doing the work you do to educate the next sort of the next generation of professional planners. So would either of you like to come in on that one?
It's I think part of the challenge is making it seem less dry, even with planning students. When we start talking about changes to the regulatory framework and the finer points of permitted development, it can sound quite dry and even boring, I think. And so I suppose it's about demonstrating how this impacts everyone, because it's impacting the quality of homes that we're all inhabiting. So it's moving the argument onto the outcomes and the way that the systems and the regulations link to the outcomes for people, I think.
Interesting.
I think there's also, going back to Hugh's point about that we're at a point now in our history where we're having to remember some of these things that we thought we knew for all these decades, but we've forgotten. You know, we have to go back to the history of planning. You know, why was planning invented to deal with some of these issues that we're having to suddenly deal with again now? So I think to make it interesting and to students, in a way, sometimes you have to take them back a little bit to understand where we came from.
Thank you. So we have a couple of really quite good questions, testing questions. I think I'm going to direct these to Hugh. I'm sure he'll be delighted to hear that. The first is from Anthony Breach. He's done a lot of influential work recently at the Centre for Cities. He asks, why should the Healthy Homes Act include minimum space standards when we know that minimum space standards make housing less affordable, induce house sharing and reduce housing supply? Hugh, do you want to take that one, and then I might give you another one afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, it depends which way you approach this, really. And we approach this from the human experience. And that presents a set of standards which create what might be described as a minimum livable environment. The issue about whether or not raising standards restricts supply is about then a secondary question about how then you deal with the housing development model, which in this country is utterly broken, has been for 30 years. So it interests me that there's a pushback saying, well, the higher standards will restrict supply. Well, it depends on the development model entirely that you care to deploy. But the core that we're clear about and will not concede on ever is that there are minimum standards that human beings need to live successful lives. And that if the economy will not service those needs, change the economy is the answer, change the delivery model. And ultimately, I guess that's what we're suggesting has to happen. And there are multiple delivery models or ways of doing that. I think more social models of delivering housing. I would only say to echo Matthew's point that there is because we're so old, and I'm so old as well, that in the 125 history of the TCPA, you can see in our minute books all the arguments that were used over the years about why we shouldn't have inside toilets, about why we shouldn't have space standards, about why working people shouldn't have gardens. Always the same arguments used. You know, somehow these conflict with a dominant economic model, which if you increase standards prevents supply. Well, we're starting from different ends, but I hope we can meet in the middle, because let's face it, the minimum space standard, 37 square meters for a one bedroom, it's not exactly generous. It's adequate, isn't it? But, you know, if we could get there, that would be an achievement.
Excellent, thanks, Hugh. And the next really interesting challenge, this time from Matthew Montague-Pollock. It's more of a challenge, so I'm going to read his contribution to the chat, and I'm going to open this up to all the panelists, but I think I'd be particularly interested to hear Millie's perspective, particularly in its relationship with accessibility. So Matthew's wondering why all new homes need to meet accessibility standards. Seems over the top. Create Streets argues that this favours certain kinds of developments, brackets apartment blocks with lifts, as opposed to multi-storey houses with staircases. This is fine for a proportion of homes, but people need high accessibility standards and are only a minority of the population, and they can only live in a certain number of homes. It doesn't seem necessary for the other homes to match these standards, given the downsides are significant. So this is really about the application of universal standards when perhaps only a certain percentage of the population is in need of those standards.
I think the answer to this mainly is that, especially in the healthy aging, we don't know what we're going to expect later in life, what kind of standards we need, what we're going to need to aid us to live independently. So the point is that we all deserve a chance in life to have these accessibility standards. We all need it to live healthy. And it doesn't affect older people, it's younger people. So I think the point is we all deserve this level of accessibility and space to have not only mental health from spending more time in our homes. The argument purely is just that to live the life we want to, we need this.
Excellent, thank you. Does anyone else like to come in that before I just do a last couple of questions and then I think we can wrap things up? Oh, excellent. Okay, so moving to the Q&A list again, Christine McGill has asked an interesting question, which runs, if we're building back better, would the panel agree that accessibility and adaptability should be on the must-have list alongside space of work at home ready homes? This is interesting. This is the flip side to the questions asked earlier around accessibility. Amelia, I suppose you want to just come in on that then in relation, I suppose you've already answered it to a degree.
Apologies, I said to Kova, I'm having difficulties hearing
Okay.
questions. I'm really sorry about that.
No, would anybody else like to?
Said Millie, so I'm really sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
I think it goes without saying that we need houses that are decent, provide decent homes and we can age in gracefully. I see absolutely no reason why we can't have, accessible toilets and accessible doorways and ramps to get in all homes, whether they are townhouses or flats. There's absolutely no reason we can't design these places so that we can age gracefully.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone asking your questions. I don't think we've got time to ask all of them. I'm going to just say, if we could bring the slide up, please, for the final slide on the slide deck. Yeah, thanks for everyone's contributions. If you want to find out more about the Healthy Homes Act campaign, please head to the TCPA website. We've got the link will be on the screen to find out more about this. You can sign up to the newsletter. This campaign logo is available there as well. And you can get plenty more information or drop us a line, and I'm sure we'd be great to hear from you. There's also plenty of content on Twitter as well. I wanted to conclude with just one of the questions. I thought this would be a really good way for Hugh to have a final say. I think in response to this question, I think it all draws together very neatly. So Lawrence Carmichael is asking if there's any suggestions for a concerted strategy to oppose the white paper. We might have all approached our submissions from slightly different perspectives. How do we ensure that we have a united front? And also, how do we engage with the developers and the private sector? So with that, I think is a really interesting position to sign off, and just to say that to watch this space when it comes to the Healthy Homes Act campaign and upcoming publications and the evidence base we're developing. I'll pass over to Hugh for the final word.
I mean, I think that we're not good or haven't been good in the past at collaborating. I trust we're going to be much better. I think the private sector private sector is very diverse and I think very worried by parts of this. Have a look at Common Ground, which the TCPA put together on Friday as as an attempt to start a shared platform that's on our website for a response to the white paper process. But I think on a dark November evening and with a US election in the background, I'm going to leave you with a hopeful point. We should be worried and we should be angry, I think, about the fact that planning and the built environment's lost its moral compass in this country. But as Matthew said, we used to be really good at this stuff, and there is no technical barrier to the creation of the most amazing places that support people's health and well-being. What we need now is we can ask a question, why us, can't we? Why are we all here at this moment, which is not the most positive of moments, perhaps. But I'm absolutely sure if we have a collective effort around the case for the Healthy Homes Act, or however you want to express it, standards, minimum standards that secure people's health and well-being and promote the potential for them to have healthy and fulfilled lives, if we can put our weight behind that idea over the next year, then that provides the biggest pushback, I think, against a sense of the kind of chaos the nation might be facing. It's a realization that people are at the heart of this process. And that is the core. That's what the Edwardians got right. That's what we get. That's what we will get right. So if we do not have the Healthy Homes Act in law by this time next year, I will appear on this screen wearing a banana outfit because I am incredibly positive that this will happen and that it has to happen. So thank you to the speakers, to all that high quality research and to all those questions, and please engage with it. You know, this is, the TCPA is very small. We need all your support. It's a collective effort, isn't it, making this happen? So thank you very much.
Thanks you, and good night, everyone. Yeah, thanks for your time.